Hello everyone, glad to see us on your channel. Today we will listen to the second part of the memoirs of François de Joffre, one of the French pilots who fought on the Soviet-German front in the Volunteer Aviation Regiment, Normandy-Niemen, from May 1944 to the day of the surrender of Nazi Germany. Now the command to take off will be given. Frozen near their cars, waiting for the order Albert, Risso, Durand, Lefebvre, La Poipe, Litolf, Castellan, Biguin, Mayeux, and others. They are in helmets, ounce with clipboards over their shoulders and TT pistols at their belts. The order will mean the end of training and the beginning of serious business. The commander of the airbase in Ivanovo, Colonel Shumov, wishes them a happy journey. The crucial moment is coming. Attention! A rocket takes off into the sky. Engines roaring, 14 yaks trembling like hounds. Here they move from the place, rushing across the snowy field, and flawlessly take off link by link. The weather is beautiful. Everyone feels great. It is not necessary to lay the course. Ahead instead of the navigator is a Russian bomber P-2. It remains only to follow him. An hour after the flight squadron Normandy safely landed at an airfield 20 kilometers from Kaluga, where it met Lieutenant General Kudikov, commander of the 1st Air Army, in which the Normandy will fight for 2 years. The pilots familiarize themselves with their frontline apartments. It is a kind of underground shelter made of pine logs, what they call here dugout. It is warm inside, as a huge stove is heated day and night, but very damp. Instead of beds, there are wooden bunks, on which we manage to fit sleeping bags. Of course, remarks La Poipe, this is not the Ritz Hotel. However, colleagues, do not forget that the front passes at most 30 kilometers from us. Not much comfort, but at least we're sheltered. Well, I like to sleep in the warmth. Captain Litholf is assembling the squad leaders. The first task, 12 yaks under the command of Major Tullian, led still P-2, must fly over the section of the front from the town of Sukhanichit to Kaluga. The purpose, to learn the landmarks, roads, forests, and so on. The next day the same task, but when returning, we have to act independently, without a navigator, a P-2 bomber. The combat time came. The first combat sorties are made as part of 4 or 8 aircraft. Normandy performs tasks to combat enemy aircraft, as well as escort and cover bombers and attack aircraft. On the section of the front, where the squadron operated, Normandy, at that time was one of the largest formations of Hitler's aviation, armed with excellent equipment, with experienced pilots, brave and determined, at that time has not yet lost faith in victory. Quite often the Germans in the air still have numerical superiority, which has to compensate for tactics, cunning, and risk. On the ground, however, a noticeable change is already emerging. The Germans are beginning to show certain signs of weakness. The German soldier no longer believes in victory, much less a quick one. The uniforms of the Germans are poor. The terrible cold takes over even the most hardened. And at a time when fatigue and doom gradually embrace almost all German units, the Red Army, on the contrary, is gaining a firm confidence in victory. The country is straining all its strength. Factories are working day and night. At the front continuously arrives combat equipment and materials. Filling their duffel bags with grenades and ammunition, the glorious Russian infantry, with cries of death to the invaders, rushes into the attack. The weather was not favorable. The sky was covered with low-leaden clouds. It had warmed sharply. The soil, a few days ago as hard as stone, was spreading underfoot. The whole of Russia became like a huge sponge that had absorbed an enormous amount of moisture. The French watched this transformation in nature with amazement. At first it seems to them that water cannot be defeated. But in 2 or 3 weeks the snow disappears, the mud dries up, the first grass breaks through, buds open, trees blossom, birch trees shed their long earrings, and Russian spring comes, the most unusual spring in the world, both tender and exuberant. On April 5, Durand and Preziosi escorted 2 P-2 bombers to the area of Roslav. The bombers flew at such a speed that the accompanying yak, barely had time to make the necessary maneuvers. Preziosi suddenly crackled in his earphones. "Hello. Attention, Preziosi. Suspicious aircraft. Check your weapons. This is Durand." After a second, his voice is heard again. "Hello. These are Focke-Wulf's 1 Menides. Every man for himself." A fight breaks out. 2 Germans dive on the bombers. The Yaks are closing in. A sharp turn, and they go into the German's tail. Preziosi is the first to open fire. He clearly sees his victim, catches it in the scope, presses the trigger. Everything is accomplished in a matter of seconds. The enemy car tumbles from side to side, turns over, then flies helplessly down, crashes into the ground and explodes. This is the first victory of 273 that French pilots have won in 3 years of war in Russia. Durand doesn't want to fall behind. He rushes into the attack. The turn is not steep enough, and his opponent manages to slip away. Durand grits his teeth in resentment. Faster, faster. He rushes at the Krot again and opens fire almost on a crossing course. Luck. The second German begins to smoke and in a few seconds explodes on the ground. On the same day, May and Albert accompanied a group of P-2s, which went deeper into the rear of the German army for more than 100 kilometers. For an aircraft like the Yak-1, it is a lot, especially when escorting, because the fighters covering the bombers have to maneuver and thus make almost double the path. As a result, Albert was forced to land in a field. His plane bogged down in the loose, wet ground. The propeller was damaged. Takeoff was out of the question. May made a better choice. He sat down on the highway, from which the next day he was able to take off and safely reach the airfield. The stormy thaw presents the sappers with almost insurmountable tasks. It is necessary to pave the roads with logs so that cars could pass. Of course, at this time have to abandon any operations of tank formations and even infantry. And that's when the Russians throw their cavalry into the fight. It attacks unexpectedly, demoralizes the German units, whose actions are paralyzed by the thaw. Sorties are becoming more frequent, more responsible, and at the same time more dangerous. On April 13th, 3 units under the command of Turbulent appear over Spastimens. Suddenly, 12 Focke-Wulf 190 fighters burst out from behind the clouds. The first major battle ensues. Turbulent manages to warn. "Hello, hello, Normans, attention. 444, the Focke-Wulfs are over us." The response of the squadron commanders is simple and concise. "We see them." The Germans probably decided to seriously teach the French, defeated in 1940, but dared to fight again, and even under Soviet banners. In the excited dance of machines guessed the rage that seized the pilots. It should be noted that almost all air battles in which participated volunteers Normandy, characterized by cruelty and ruthlessness. For each fighter, Normandy, shot down in battle, they paid with the lives of 5 of their pilots. In the spacious spring sky began a deadly duel, a frenzied merry-go-round. The airplanes entered the circle, one in the tail of the other. Woe to the one who could not withstand the adopted pace, who would break away from the group, who would turn aside. A machine gun burst would be the punishment for this oversight. The circle widens, narrows, suddenly breaks, closes and breaks again. The machine guns crackle. Mayeux and Durand are the first to shoot down their opponents. But Bizine, D'Urville, and Poznanski will never return to the airfield. General Kudikov is very disturbed by these losses. 3 deaths in 2 weeks of fighting is hard. He has a long talk with Turbulent. He asks him to take all measures to preserve the combat effectiveness of the Normandy. Too much courage is not enough. At this rate, it will not last long. The future was not slow to confirm his right. After 4 months, despite some replenishment in the squadron, remained alive only 5 pilots. After the visit of General Kudikov, the same evening it was announced that the Normandy will be relocated to Mosels. This was the first relocation of the 30 that she made on the Russian front. From now on, her fate will be closely linked to the fate of the 18th Guards Fighter Regiment. At dawn on April 17, for the first time 5 Yaks of the 18th Guards Fighter Regiment and 6 Yaks Normandy jointly blocked the airfield in Sestia, preventing enemy planes from taking off. At this time, 500 Soviet bombers strike 4 German airfields, including the Sestia airfield. In the future, Normandy quite often had to fly on combat missions together with the 18th Guards Regiment. How many times pilots of this regiment rescued our pilots from trouble? Soviet pilots treated their French colleagues with great respect. On May 7 began sorties to attack enemy airfields. An order was received requiring the destruction of as many German airplanes on the ground as possible. It was these actions, the order said, were the most effective, but they were also the most dangerous. Most of all, the pilots of the Normandy were afraid of a forced landing in enemy territory. After all, Vichy Radio has already repeatedly announced that they should be considered as Frantirov, with all the ensuing consequences, so it was not without a slight tingle in their hearts that they listened to the command orders relayed by Litov. Today, May 7, assault enemy airfields. The main blow to the airfield in Spasdeminsk. Aim more accurately and don't be late in opening fire. Do not allow useless approaches. Hit as many Krauts as possible, but avoid forced landings. That's what I demand above all else. Under the command of Turbulent 11 Yak, appear over the airfield Spasdeminsk. Anti-aircraft artillery opens hurricane fire. The air ceaselessly pierced the shells of anti-aircraft guns. 11 fighters rapidly dive on the Messerschmitts, Focke-Wulfs, and Junkers, which are in the parking lot. You can see how the airplanes with black crosses on the wings catch fire. Germans are trying to take cover in trenches and shelters, but they are overtaken by machine gun bursts. It seems as if it's all happening in a drill. Hello? Hello. Mission accomplished. Assemble at an altitude of 3,000 meters, commands Tulian. Everyone except May follows the order. His car is hit. May tries to get away at a low angle, but he fails, and he is forced to land in enemy territory, 20 kilometers from Spasdeminsk. The landing is terrible. The tail of the plane breaks off and crumbles into small pieces. May is severely injured. He is bleeding to death. He is captured. He has to spend almost 3 years behind the barbed wire of a concentration camp. The day's fighting was over. In the officers' mess hall, they were summarizing the first weeks of fighting. They were disappointing, but everyone tried to keep a cheerful mood. They thought about when they would be able to eat Marseille's oyster and lobster soup, or Parisian steaks with fried potatoes. They talked about France, about love and lovers, long and tediously compared French wines with Russian vodka, argued about how plausible the rumors about the arrival of reinforcements. The rumors were confirmed. As if from the sky fell to us 5 pilots, 3 of whom came from Madagascar. Durand greeted the new arrivals with the following words. Everything you've had up to now is just flowers. The berries are ahead. You will experience firsthand here that it's not the same. Relocation again. Kozulsk, then Katenki. New stages of our wandering in Russia. Here we meet Russian cavalrymen returning from Stalingrad. There is a grandiose fraternization, then treating with vodka, dancing to the famous harmonica, without which a Russian probably could not live. The melody of the heartfelt Russian song, Dark Night, is heard. It is necessary to hear the song Mama, the music and words of which grab the soul, and other Russian songs born of war to understand the soul of a Slav. Glorification of bravery, love for the native land, hymn to the exploits at the front, and in the rear self-sacrifice in the name of the motherland. Thirst for life and contempt for death. All these themes are closely intertwined in the songs, complementing each other, and all this in a wonderfully colorful and rich language. In moments of rest in the evenings, Russians gather in a circle with an accordionist and dancers in the center. Everybody pulls up the chorus, claps their hands in unison. The rhythm of the music becomes faster and faster. The dancer spins, goes on a wheel, and when one exhausted dancer stops, Another one comes out to replace him in the circle. During one of these parties, Albert reported the arrival of Major Poyet with 7 new airmen and an interpreter. They were Lieutenants Leon, de Tedesco, Boob, Barbier, and aspirants Vermeil, Mathis, and Balcout, who had escaped from occupied France not more than a year before. They were given a warm welcome. All night long they made toasts that came to mind, beginning with a toast to France and ending with a toast to the health of Marshal Stalin. The newcomers were immediately taught to drink in Russian, that is, the entire shot glass in one gulp. The new edition was valuable in 2 respects. First, it brought with it the flavor of France, and second, it arrived just in time, as the German fighters were becoming more and more aggressive and desperate. They wanted to restore confidence to the infantrymen who were losing ground under their feet from the Red Army's blows. They told about a dramatic case that occurred over enemy territory with the crew of one of the P-2 bombers. The aircraft commander, Major Petrov, was killed by a shrapnel of an 80mm anti-aircraft shell. His navigator managed to move to the pilot's seat and grab the control lever. He randomly pulled it, trying to remember the movements that in similar cases performed by the pilot. Not knowing how to fly an airplane at all, he managed to fly over the front line on a car engulfed in flames. Only after that he left it, having jumped out with a parachute. Such feats raised the morale of French volunteers. Shocked by the death of a Soviet pilot, Lowpoint pursued one of the Focke-Wulfs so persistently that he damaged his eardrums in a dizzying dive. He was sent to a Moscow hospital. At dawn on June 27, the pair of Tullien and Begin take to the air for a free hunt. The meeting with the enemy does not keep waiting. Instantly a battle ensues. Tullien turns his adversary to flight, but Begin at the moment when he prepared to shoot down the enemy plane. Machine guns fail. He tries to get out of the battle. The German, realizing what is going on, begins to pursue. Begin's fuel is running out. His situation is desperate. Russian anti-aircraft gunners are trying their best to support him. At the airfield, all the personnel of the Normandy, powerless to help Begin, watching the fight, the outcome of which no one has no doubt. Only a miracle can save their comrade. And it was a miracle. Major Tullien returned after the chase. He throws himself at the Focke-Wulf. The German escapes by firing several rounds at Begin's airplane, which is going to land. Yeah, Begin would have been in trouble. As the plane taxied to its hiding place, the engine suddenly goes silent. There was not a drop of gasoline left in the tanks. In the fall, Begin left the Normandy. In 1944, he was killed by a stray anti-aircraft gun shell during a routine patrol flight over the Dutch coast. Thus, having emerged unscathed from hundreds of altercations, Begin was killed by a ridiculous accident. The feat of Major Tullien, who helped Begin, did not go unnoticed. The newspaper Pravda devoted several articles to the French pilots. Tullien, Lidolf, Durand, Lefebvre, Duprat were awarded Russian military orders of the Patriotic War. In mid-July, the Red Army launched an offensive. 48 hours in a row, without a single minute of respite, rumbling tens of thousands of guns, comparing to the ground the German defense on a stretch of the front stretching 50 kilometers. Here it is, the famous Russian firing shaft. Artillerymen, drunk with rumbling and fatigue, seem chained to their guns. The casings of the guns are red-hot from prolonged firing. In the enemy's position, everything is ablaze. Everything is crushed, crumpled, destroyed. After this shower of steel comes the turn of the pilots to grapple in mortal combat in the summer sky. In between battles, barely managed to carve out time to celebrate the French national holiday of July 14 under the rumbling of cannons. The tricolor and red flags fly side by side on a tall mast set in the center of a small forest clearing. Captain Deforge reads Major Tullien's short order. There are no speeches. The whole ceremony lasts 10 minutes. 10 minutes that cannot be forgotten. There's all the vodka you want at lunch at noon, but not now. From 14 to 21 hours, the squadron makes 25 sorties and shoots down 2 Messerschmitt 110. One shot down Albert. The other, Major Poyet, paired with Bequin. For Poyet, it was the first victory on the Russian front. In addition, one Focke-Wulf 190 fighter was shot down, which Castellan pierced with a machine gun burst with the speed and precision of a matador. That day, the Normandy pilots met Soviet General Zakharov, an experienced fighter pilot, a tall, athletically built, broad-shouldered blond man with blue eyes. His appearance alone spoke of his ability to lead people. But even this bright day was marred. De Tedesco did not return from his mission. Severely wounded, he did not have time to leave the damaged aircraft, which exploded on impact with the ground. De Tedesco's demise seemed especially hard on everyone that evening. July 14, 1943, when Albert recalled with his stories the street balls in the pre-war years and the happy people who could dance by the light of lanterns at the entrance to the little bistros. The 3 days that followed will undoubtedly remain 3 of the most glorious and yet most brutal days of the war in the history of the Normandy. The pilots are overworked. They are constantly in the air. Deep wrinkles on their faces, eyes glistening feverishly with sleeplessness. Battles follow one after another. After landing does not pass in 10 minutes, as in the sky, torn by bursts of shells, a new battle is tied. July 15, Turbulent and Deforge shoot down 2 fighters, Meuse-Ripmet 110. This German high-speed twin-engine fighter lacked sufficient maneuverability. Russian Yaks were quickly attached to their tail, and everything ended after the first machine gun bursts. The brutality of the fighting reaches its limit on July 16 and 17. A large detachment of Normandy, led by Turbulent, meets at 14:30 hours with a dense group of bombers Junkers 87, accompanied by large groups of fighters Focke-Wulf 190, echeloned in height. Litolf, Castellan, and Leon, coming in from the sun's side, attack the bombers. They are followed by Poyet and Bernavon. Turbulent and Albert cover them from the fighters. The sky is swarming with airplanes that soar upward, dive rapidly, and circle with a terrible roar. Leon, spinning like a wolf, shoots down 2 fighters in 10 minutes. Poyet finishes off a bomber. Then Turbulent and Albert get into a fight with 2 Germans. Turbulent, taking advantage of the fact that the sun blinds the enemy, shoots him almost at point-blank range. No sooner had Turbulent looked at the enemy plane falling to the ground, smoking like a raw log, than he was attacked by 4 enemy fighters. He manages to elude them. Having completely used up his ammunition and with very little gasoline left, he returns to the airfield. Poyet is already here. His face, usually scowling, looks especially stern today. He runs up to his old comrade and comrade in arms and barely squeezes himself out. You know, Litolf, Castellan, and Bernavon have not returned. Captain Litolf, the stern, ascetic Litolf, demanding to his subordinates and even more demanding to himself, dies in battle along with Lieutenant Castellan. Surrounded by a flock of Focke-Wulfs and Messerschmitts that pounced on him, he shot down 2 Germans in an unequal battle near Smolensk, but died himself, crashing into the ground on a car engulfed in flames. It happened on July 16, 1944, near the village of Krasnikovo, located between 2 large Russian cities, Orel and Bryansk. By this time, Litolf already had on his combat account 14 shot-down enemy planes. His life can serve as an example. Turbulent stands leaning against the wing of his yak, plunged into sorrowful reflection. Here he pulls off his helmet, tiredly runs his hand over his face, through his sweat-slicked hair, and says to Poyet, "We shall avenge them tomorrow. You, Poyet, will take command of the 2nd detachment in place of Litolf." But Major Poyet never had time to take command of the 2nd detachment. The next day in the evening, he was appointed squadron commander in place of Major Turbulent, who that day did not return from a combat mission. It happened at 5:30 in the evening in the area of Znamenskaya. Here the last seen how Turbulent's airplane, exactly Harpoon, crashed into a group of Focke-Wulf. There were more than 50 of them, and the French, 10. No one will never be able to tell about the drama played out in the air. Turbulent took with him the secret of his death. The next day, Poyet reported the results of the last battles. From July 13 to July 17, Normandy made 11 combat sorties, which was shot down 17 enemy aircraft. 6 of our pilots did not return. For 3 months already, 10 volunteers Squadron Normandy gave their lives in the fight for freedom. General Zakharov, commander of the 303rd Fighter Division, which included the Squadron Normandy, called Major Poyet in his headquarters, or as we call it, the CP. He shook Poyet's hand firmly and looked him in the eyes in silence for a long time. Finally, the general spoke. Major Poyet, I first of all want to tell you that the Soviet command and our entire division, deeply saddened by the death of Major Turbulent, he will forever remain for us the brightest example of bravery and heroism of French pilots. It was with deep emotion that we learned of the death of this fearless, exemplary commander. This loss will further strengthen the friendship between Soviet and French pilots. Together, shoulder to shoulder, we will go to victory. We will avenge our fallen friends. Together we will liberate our lands from Hitler's invaders. Suddenly General Zakharov stopped talking and embarrassedly took his eyes aside. After a short pause, trying to give his voice a tinge of sternness and firmness, although he clearly did not succeed, he continued. However, Major Poyet, it must never be forgotten that the journey that awaits us will be long and arduous. Therefore, I demand that without an order or authorization of the division command, you personally do not fly on combat missions. Yes, my general, replied Poyet, visibly annoyed and resolved to himself never to reckon with this restriction. 3 hours after the conversation with the General, Poyet flies out to Barrage at the head of a group of 6 yak. What luck! The detachment captures by surprise 2 junkers who had the imprudence and insolence to stroll without fighter escort. A short, curt command on the radio, and Deforge, Leon, Albert, and Risso begin the classic capture in the pincers. It's instantaneous. A few turns, and yaks are in the tail of the junkers. The engine of the first bomber ignites. Almost plumb he dives to the ground. Shooter aft turret does not respond. He, apparently, killed by the first machine gun burst. A long plume of thick black smoke stretches behind the fuselage. It seems that the plane is about to crash into a small birch grove visible below. Nothing like that. With the greatest effort, the pilot takes the plane out of dive. Like a big hit bird, he, convulsively swaying, glides parallel to the ground, and then soars into the sky and disappears into the clouds. A quarter of an hour after the return of the yaks to the airfield infantry reported the fall of the hit enemy bomber. With the most imperturbable look, Major Poyet reports to General Zakharov, Comrade General, today, July 19, we present you with our 30th victory. The general laughs merrily. Oh, those French! It seems that their discipline is not at its best, but this will not prevent them from having heroes of the Soviet Union in their ranks very soon. On the same day, that is, July 19, a new pilot arrives, a graduate student Larjo, and returns from the Moscow Hospital de la Poipe, whom Albert accused of being fat, forgetting everything because of the pretty nurses of the Moscow Hospital in Sokolniki. Late in the evening, it became known that at a neighboring airfield landed the first pilot who deserted from the German army. If they all follow his example, we will very soon become unemployed. Jokes in the officers' canteen, La Poipe, rubbing his hands with pleasure at the sight of the front portion of vodka. Well, don't count on it especially, Albert remarks, as if foreseeing that his comrade and himself after the end of the war will wear the gold star on their chests for the victories won. Soon a new replenishment arrives from Moscow. Denis, Astir, Foucault, Ray de Sibir, the son of a famous pilot, and finally, Foru, a slender, handsome man who came to Russia straight from the student bench from Algeria. With the same airplane came the list of the first awardees. Immediately after the arrival of the airplane, the entire flight crew lined up on the platform near a small mast on which the Soviet and French flags were flying. In the sky heard the distinctive rumble of airplanes flying towards the front. From the horizon came the muffled rumble of artillery. In the distance, the black smoke of fires, blown by the steppe wind, was slowly billowing over the groves. These were exciting moments for those who were already called old men and for those who were still green. Squadron Commander Poyad stood at attention in front of the formation. Says the Soviet officer, minting every word. Major Poyad, on behalf of the Soviet government, I have the honor to give you the orders of the Patriotic War, which were awarded to Major Tulian and Captain Litov, who were killed in action. And the two orders are immediately attached to the remaining after their deaths parade tunic. Then awards are given to Durand, Lefebvre, and Duprat. On the lapels of their marching uniforms pinned orders, on which gilded gleaming sickle and hammer. Barely had time to accept the most sincere congratulations of their friends, as the camp instantly spread the important news. Soon our mechanics will leave. They will be sent to the Middle East, and they will be replaced by Russians, who are not afraid of harsh climatic conditions and better know the subtleties of yaks. The next day, graduate student Laurent, recently arrived from Madagascar, made the whole squadron worried. During the performance exercise in airplane navigation, he lags behind Major Poyad. Bad weather plays out. Lost orientation pilot wanders like a blind man. Below him on the ground is a monotonous picture: forests, roads, lakes, and fields. The fog distorts the outlines of even those individual landmarks that he managed to memorize. What to do? He doesn't know where the front line is. Fuel is running low. Laurent's excitement turns to anxiety. Where to land? Confused, he flies one way and another, returns, descends almost to the ground, circling over the same place, and yet his luck has not deserted him. Behind one of the many similar birch groves, he suddenly sees a deserted field. A month ago it served as an airfield. He sets the car down and lies for 6 days in the village of Rokanovo, surrounded by the care of the collective farmers. Damn Laurent. He caused a lot of excitement to his friends from the Normandy. Change of airfield again. The regiment will now be based in Spastimens. On the arch at the entrance to the airfield, a large banner with the inscription, "Welcome, Normandy pilots, brave sons of the French people. Together with our allies, we will defeat the hated enemy." The main airfield here serves us only for rest. In the mornings, the yaks take off to another airfield, located only 5 kilometers from the front line. From this airfield, the duty units take off. From here, Albert, Lefebvre, and Largeau take off for new exploits. From the same piece of land rises in the air Lyon to save the life of Foucault, whose plane was seriously damaged by anti-aircraft shells. And it was here that the event occurred, which deeply saddened all the pilots of the Normandy. One early morning, Poelade went into one of the dugouts. "Astier and Ray, fly to our former base in Kozulsk and deliver there an urgent report. Take the Po-2. Astier will lead the plane, Ray for the navigator. Be especially careful in the front line area. You may be fired upon." 20 minutes later, Po-2, piloted by Astier, flew over the front line at 120 kilometers per hour. The German air defense decided to get even with the defenseless victim. Guns, machine guns, and even rifles. Everything was put into action. Within 2 minutes, the car was literally riddled. How Astier managed to make a U-turn and under a hail of bullets, looping and maneuvering, to reach the Russian positions, no one, even he himself, could not explain. The more fiercely the Kroats rained down on him, the more stubbornly he tried to stay in the air. At this time, on the back seat, instead of the navigator, lay the mangled corpse of Ray. After landing in Sukhanichi, where Astier was bandaged right on the airfield, he returned to the regiment and brought the body of his dead comrade. A terrible sight. Astier is so depressed that he cannot utter a word. The last sorties are over. 6 pilots carried hastily chipped from Newboard's coffin to the grave, just dug by Russian soldiers. In the unusual silence that reigns over the steppe, illuminated by the purple rays of the setting sun, a farewell salvo is heard, the last honors, a final farewell. So on August 29, 1943, another of the Normandy volunteers was buried in the war-torn Belarusian soil. The very next day, the Germans paid dearly for the death of Ray. Only for one sortie, the second wing shot down 3 Junkers and damaged 3 others. In the dining room, Albert suggested that the Germans are plotting some new mischief. "I'm sure the Germans have planted Heinkel 111 bombers here. You'll see, we'll have to deal with them very soon. Tomorrow is August 31st, and we should finish the month properly. But caution won't hurt. The villains will certainly be under heavy cover." Indeed, the last day of August was a terrible day. As Albert had anticipated, the squadron met in the air, in addition to fighters Focke-Wulf 190, bombers Junkers 87 and Junkers 88, also the famous Heinkel 111 bombers. In the morning, Lefebvre, Albert, Risso, and Lepoix shot down 1 Junkers 87 bomber. This was the 42nd Normandy victory. In the afternoon, 10 Yaks flew with the task of covering from the air Yelnya. The city was burning. Above it was a dense cloud of smoke and ashes. At an altitude of 3,500 meters, planes were scurrying around like disturbed bees. Attention! At 9 and 3 o'clock, Heinkels, covered by Focke-Wulfs, heard in the headphones. 10 Yaks pounce on 100-plus German bombers, accompanied by large groups of fighters. The Germans have decided to level Yelnya to the ground. All their aviation on this section of the front was in the air. Normandy rushes into the attack first. After a combat turn, in which the engines give all their power, Yaks attack a group of 30 Heinkel. A fierce battle ensues. It seems that in one ball mixed wings, fuselages, propellers, formed a real mess of metal and wood, boiling in a hurricane of fire. The opponents try to preempt each other. Durand kills the first Heinkel. The battle reaches a climax. Faces of pilots distorted from incredible overload. From the rush of blood to the head darkens in the eyes, chained to the sights, and fingers convulsively clench the throttles. In a fantastic cycle at maximum speeds, reminiscent of motorcycle races in the Wheel of Death at the fair during the holidays, everyone waits for the mistake of his opponent. Sooner or later it must happen, and it is not forgiven. Foucault, Leon, Risso, and Mathis hit the exact target and set 3 Focke-Wulfs on fire. But the Germans do not remain in debt. Captain de Forge, aspirants Laurent, Foru, and de Sibber are shot down. Laurent and Foru manage to escape, but for de Forge and de Sibor, the morning of August 31 was the last. Another hard night in the dugouts, when good spirits are kept artificially high, and any jokes seem tortured. Squirming in sleeping bags before falling asleep, everyone recalls dear images of relatives and friends left behind in distant France or comrades who are no longer alive. And everyone is unable to silence the inner voice. And tomorrow? Whose turn is it? Maybe mine. And then comes tomorrow, of course, which does not give an answer to this question. They say that days are different from one another, but at the front they're all like 2 drops of water. They can be compared to a series of photo cards printed from the same negative. There is nothing more ordinary, more monotonous than the life of pilots at war. They get up, eat, fly out, fight or not fight, die or not die. And in the evening, if they return, they dine in the same place, from the same plate, to then sink into sleep, which, no matter how long it lasts, always seems very short. The intense fatigue is keenly felt in every muscle, fogs the head. My heart beats in time with the mentally uttered words, "Who's next in line? Who's next?" But faces tense in a mocking smile, and only jokes and anecdotes come off the lips. And only when, in the middle of a joke, the narrator's gaze inadvertently stops on the empty sleeping bag in which the comrade will no longer spread his tired body, his eyes begin to blink in confusion, as if death had cast its fixed, insolent gaze on the supposed merrymaker. If a comrade dies, that day they speak of him almost in a whisper. the next day more loudly. Then they divide his belongings among themselves, and then only rarely can one hear. Yes, do you remember someone like that? So only a fleeting memory remains of the man. September 1st. Summer is gone. Yellowed leaves fall from the trees, slowly circling above the ground. The air grows colder, the morning dawn more gray. Russian autumn is creeping up with small, hurried steps. And behind it, we can already guess such a terrible winter. Just before the cold weather arrives, Duran dies. Leon once manages to slip away from the shell, but 2 days later another shell, piercing the cabin, nails him to the seat. The plane crashes into the ground 6 kilometers east of Yelny. The ranks of pilots are melting. The formation of the squadron is sad and sorrowful. Died more than survived. Arrived replenishment. Morier, Jord, de Saint-Phal. Not enough to plug the holes punched by German machine guns. It is necessary that the replenishment exceeds the losses, but it turns out the opposite. The squadron is relocating again. Is this really the last move before the end, before total exhaustion due to lack of fighters? With a sullen look, Quiet announces our move from Spasteminsk to Mishkovo. Only 20 kilometers in a straight line separate us from the new airfield, but 2 square squat trucks, produced at one of the tractor factories evacuated to the Urals. It took 4 hours to overcome this distance, and they were driven by experienced chauffeurs, guys unusually quick and dexterous. They had to cross rivers, move along the roads from which there was only one name left, drag along the highway, torn by the tracks of tanks, disfigured by shell craters, wade through disfigured forests with trees cut down to a meter from the ground, pass by burned tanks, overturned and mangled cars, overturned carts, broken guns, ruined dugouts. Such a mind-boggling sight was the former front line near Spasteminsk, abandoned by the Wehrmacht after long, brutal, and bloody battles. In Mishkov, Normandy stayed 15 days. During this time, new planes armed with 20mm guns arrived, and Lefebvre, Lapoix, Risso, Albar, and Foucault had time to increase the list of their victories over the Focke-Wulfs. Just before the move to the new airfield died Larjo. During those 15 days, Preziosi and Castellan went missing. Vigin and our famous Albert were awarded the Orders of the Patriotic War. September 6, Mathis, wounded in the arm, was forced to jump out with a parachute. He was picked up by the crew of a Russian tank making a reconnaissance raid behind German lines. Mathis had with him the discharge certificate of a killed German soldier, and only with great difficulty he managed to prove to his rescuers that this certificate was taken by him as a souvenir. Autumn is in full swing. The days are getting shorter. The ranks of French pilots continue to thaw, but we must brace ourselves, as the battle for Smolensk is just beginning. The goal of the next Russian offensive is to force the Dnieper, the majestic river, which for more than 2,000 kilometers slowly carries its waters through the fertile flowering fields of Belarus and Ukraine. On the Dnieper stand the cities, the names of which, when reading the battle communiques, sound like fanfare signals. They are Smolensk, Mogilev, Kiev, the heart, mind, and soul of the beautiful Ukraine, Dnipropetrovsk, and the marvelous dam of the Dnieper, which the Russians blew up during the German offensive, destroying in a few seconds the miracle created according to the 5-year plan. Let us add at once that even before the complete liberation of Ukraine, work began on the restoration of the dam, and Russian workers, selfless in labor, as well as soldiers at the front, prepared the power plant for commissioning in record time. Today, bloody battles are fought over this river and these cities. In honor of any corner of the liberated land, Moscow salutes with salvos of all batteries of the Moscow air defense. When night falls, over the capital flashes a huge fireworks display, in the light of which looms the majestic towers of the Kremlin. Normandy advances with the Soviet troops. Another Normandy base is Badgers, a small town that had been under German occupation for 2 years. It has just been liberated. In the town square, under the muzzles of carbines of Soviet cavalrymen, gathered traitors who collaborated with the Germans during the occupation. In separate groups they are led to a brick wall, and after reading out the sentence, are shot. The crackle of the volleys merges with the rumble of the guns rumbling a few kilometers west of the city. For 6 months now this rumbling has been heard continuously, but today it seems to have come even closer. The rains are beginning to fall. The French welcome the change in weather with great joy. Along with the rains, an army theater arrives at the front. Its program included folk dances, small vaudevilles, satirical plays about Nazi leaders, solo numbers, and choral performances. The period of respite drags on. How necessary. Sleep, sleep. The mere thought that one can get a full night's sleep on a wooden bed brings a great unknown pleasure. There will be no sorties today. These words seem to be the limit of happiness. The pilots get up late. They wander around the town, talking to rare passers, by who managed to escape from the Germans, who took with them the entire able-bodied population, having previously destroyed the elderly and the sick. Local residents tell them about the actions of the Soviet partisans. In remote areas, partisans, entire military units, maintaining constant communication with Moscow, caused the Germans a lot of trouble. Sometimes fierce battles were played out, but more often coming out of the endless forests, where the Germans did not dare to go deeper for fear of ambushes. The partisans attacked the sentries, broke into the huts where the German officers were housed. After completing the sortie, they again went into the forests. The respite ended. On the night of September 18, red and green rockets soared into the sky. This Po-2 leave the airfield and go to smash the German rear. These planes have a low speed and provide great accuracy bombing. If I may say so, they deliver to the house one bomb weighing 250 kilograms. It is difficult to imagine how in total darkness they managed to find an ammunition depot, a food train, a hut where the German headquarters is located, everything that serves as a target for them. They turn off their engines and spiral noiselessly toward the target to drop the bomb as accurately as a soldier throws a grenade. When stretched out in their sleeping bags, our pilots hear the engine of a single Po-2 flying over the airfield. They can't help but count in their minds the few minutes that separate them from a strong, deafening explosion. Well, they got it in the teeth, Albert mutters when he hears the explosion. And all fall asleep with a slight smile on their lips and with a calm heart. September 19, Normandy again begins active operations, on its account of 3 more downed aircraft. But the next day, Valque was caught by surprise by a large group of Focke-Wulfs, which came out from behind the clouds from the direction of the sun. His plane, engulfed in flames, crashes to the ground and explodes in a small field near Nyazi Selo. The Russians buried Balku in the square in the center of the village. Balku's death hardens his partner Risso. Revenge is a dish to be eaten hot, and over the next few days, Risso surpasses himself by shooting down 2 German Junkers 87 bombers. Risso's success inspires his comrades. On the day of liberation of Smolensk and Roslavel by the Soviet troops, Normandy shoots down 7 enemy planes. How much joy at once! Songs, jokes, competitions, and eloquence. There is hope that the end of the war is not far off, that now everything will go very quickly, and that soon you can again see Paris, our Paris, with its balls, women, and small bistros, the Seine, the boulevards, the Champs-Élysées, which is constantly reminded of Albert. But soon we have to give up these sweet illusions. The fighting resumes. Again, victories and losses. Much excitement brought his comrades Lieutenant Morier, who once took to the air on the plane of the regiment commander. 10 times he tried to sit down, and each time it seemed that he was about to break his neck. Finally, he manages to land the machine. He is pale as a sheet. Poyet runs up to him, ready to swear with the last words, but Morier calmly reports, "My commander, your plane was saved by a miracle just like me." The tail wheel broke off on takeoff. The rudder control was disrupted. I was hot, but I wanted to save the plane at any cost. And I succeeded. Another incident. Janelle, along with Begin, Risso, and Bon, were on a patrol mission. At an altitude of about 2,500 meters, they notice a group of P-2 bombers fighting off half a dozen Focke-Wulf. Shall we go to the rescue? Let's go. Biguin, having increased speed, drags the wingman behind him, and they get involved in the battle. The Russians are overjoyed at the unexpected help. The fight continues. The Germans maneuver, circling, dodging the fight, except for one, which undercuts Janel. The yak bursts into flames. Janel jumps out with a parachute, but the parachute turns out to be damaged by bullets. The descent is more like a free fall. Janel sees the ground approaching fast. He tries to land as softly as possible, shrinking into a ball. As he falls, Janel injures his spine and loses consciousness. He regains consciousness while already on the armor of a Russian tank. He is taken to the Moscow Military Hospital in Sokolniki, where he later recovered. On October 5 at dawn, the Normandy planes take off to make another leap forward. The front has moved away from Badgers more than 150 kilometers. The Germans are running everywhere, running so fast that they do not always have time to fulfill the order received to burn everything in their retreat. At the head of the Normandy flew General Zakharov himself on his high-speed La-5, which he piloted out of habit without closing the cockpit lantern. The planes landed near the village of Sloboda. Barely the squadron had time to get settled in a new place, as a panting interpreter comes running. My commander just called from the division. The order is to urgently send 4 fighters to Borovskoy to escort the Douglas that arrived from Moscow, on which General Petit is flying to us. The arrival of an airplane from Moscow always caused the liveliest conversations. The very first and most important question on everyone's mind was, are there any letters? After all, during the war in Russia, the thought that you are thousands of kilometers away from home, family, motherland, and do not know if you can get any news from there was so burdensome. At least a postcard, a simple newspaper or magazine, even if it was about hunting or philately, but from France, written in French and published by the French, instead of ridiculous newsletters from Algeria. We wanted the paper to smell of France, the flavor of its land, its air. This time the airplane does not disappoint the poor exiles. There are letters and newspapers. New interpreters have also arrived. There are promotion orders and awards. And finally, General Petit himself has arrived. He personally wants to familiarize himself with the fighting life led by his soldiers. This opportunity is given to him. In the days of his stay in the squadron, combat sorties do not stop. He sees off the planes flying out on a mission and meets them, and if missing one or two, runs up to the returning pilots and excitedly asks, "Who didn't come back? Was he saved? Did you see him? Didn't he burn up in the airplane?" Well, the command wanted to familiarize on the spot with how the Normandy volunteers live. Now they even know how they die. First, Streetfowl didn't return for his first mission. The next day, Biguin, Bone, and Dennis did not return. The general doesn't want to hear any more about the losses, but if he had stayed with us until October 15, he could have been present at Barbier's last sortie, the last casualty of the Normandy regiment during the first campaign in Russia. The deaths of Dennis and Bone were subsequently confirmed, but Saint Fowl and Biguin were only wounded. That's a stroke of luck. If any of the pilots do not return to the airfield, there is still hope that he remained alive. A missing person does not always die. He may make an emergency landing. He may jump out with a parachute. But if one or the other happened in enemy territory, the fate of the pilot was as unenviable as that of a pilot killed in action. Of all the French pilots who fell into the hands of the Germans, only 4 survived. We never learned anything about the others. Some time later, one captured German pilot was interrogated. He was asked why the German army commits such unnecessary cruelties as complete destruction of towns and villages. He answered us, "Das ist Krieg." Such a statement indicated that the French pilots had very little chance of surviving being captured by the Germans on the Russian front. One had to reason and act as this German did. A white carpet covered the ground. It was as if nature was ashamed of the monstrous destruction and wanted to cover the terrible traces of war. Shell craters, burned tanks, ruins of buildings, wreckage of broken airplanes, thousands and thousands of corpses. Under a light white blanket, it all looked less ugly. From now on, Russia for a long 5 months will live a completely different life, different from the one that began after the spring thaw. November 6, 1943 at 10 o'clock 30 minutes in the morning, flying at a breakneck speed over the land, which left so many of our comrades, the surviving pilots of the Normandy, were leaving the front. In Moscow, they were waiting for the plane of Colonel de Marmure. He brought them the gratitude of France, and by order of de Gaulle pinned to their banner of the Order of the Cross for Liberation. A few days later, 3 pilots in fur coats and high hats, on which burned the emblem of fighting France, came to Red Square. They stopped in front of the Kremlin, and for several minutes in complete silence, looked at its tall towers with stars on the spires, burning red fire in the descending dusk. "I've told you this many times," Albert murmured. "The hardest thing was to hold out. We managed to survive this hell, and that's not a bad thing." Risso and Laporte agreed with him. They then made their way to the Moscow restaurant. Making his way through the crowd that looked at them with surprise, Albert finished his thought. "No, that's not all. It seems that there, in Algeria, they finally moved and will send us some godly help for our poverty. In the meantime, folks, we still have a chance to go to the movies and the circus." Algiers, October 1943. Rain floods the airfield. Midnight. The black sky is filled with the rumble of transport planes and bombers rushing to their bases in Tunisia and Sardinia. 15 French pilots, making up the first group of Normandy replenishment, have just been seated in an American 4-engine airplane. All are silent, only Feldzer said, as if continuing the conversation, which led with himself in moments of long reflection. "They will be happy that we are in time to go to their aid. The commander of the Normandy Tulian died. Most of the flight crew is out of action. It's obviously bloody cold in Russia, but I'm getting hot at the thought of our losses. I want to say something, but he puts his hand on my shoulder. Dear Feldzer, the soul of our group, where would we be without him? He looks at me and throws me a brief glance. Sleep. Soon we'll be in Cairo. But he himself falls asleep first, dropping his head on his chest. A storm is raging outside the plane. We are perfectly settled in luxurious seats. The smooth noise of the engines lulls us to sleep. The rumblings of thunder do not disturb the pleasant feeling of peace and tranquility that reigns in the cabin. To avoid the storm area, the airplane changes course. We can no longer see the sea from the windows. The airplane flies over the Libyan desert. In the morning, we are greeted by bright sun, dazzling sky, dazzling sand, and there, in the distance, on the border of a verdant oasis, squeezed between 2 strips of desert, Cairo, a port on the Nile, in the center of the fertile Nile Valley. At Heliopolis Airfield, the pilots are embraced by Arevian, one of the oldest veterans of the Foreign Legion. He places at our complete disposal the club and restaurant belonging to him. In Cairo, we find ourselves in a corner of the pre-war world. No blackout, no patrols, no surveillance. Everywhere, life is booming. Erebarn, my old comrade and colleague at the flight school, Neat Verdier, Banier, Funnyman Carbon, de Failton, Lebra, who managed to cross the whole of Spain, a gastronome, and a great gourmandor, a group of Africans, Feldzer, Marchi, Delane, Andre, Roger, and Jean Sauvage, Cazeneuve, Caffot, Amarger, Desgenet, Desagne, de Saint-Marceau, Bright, Penverne, and myself, all of us, stunned, wandered the streets, now and then sticking our noses into shop windows, drunk on music and blinded by neon. We were honored as if we had served in the Normandy from day one of its existence. The glory that surrounded our comrades went to us as well. We flew to Turin with full stomachs and heavy heads. We had to stay there for about 2 months. A lot of anxiety was caused by the notorious visas, which we could not get for a long time. Our life here was almost no different from that of our predecessors. Reception followed reception. The monotony of this life was fortunately broken by the mischief of carbon. Once, during a high-pitched, ultra-patriotic speech of approximately the following content: "Gentlemen pilots, you are on your way to the USSR to fight the Teutonic oppressor. We know that you will be worthy ambassadors of the ever-living France, and that the blood you will shed on the icy expanses of the steppes in these battles of the Titans, when the fate of the civilization that..." Our carbon began to chew with gusto on the feather that adorned the hat of his neighbor, the wife of the Iranian minister. The military attaché, Colonel Jubal, then summoned the peckish Carbon to him and said, "Carbone, you will receive 2 weeks of strict arrest. You will serve your time at the transit station and will be in Major Smith's custody there." Carbon clicked his heels. "Yes, my colonel." For the next 2 weeks, the whole French colony was like a fever because of carbon. Carbonists and anti-carbonists alike. Rumors of the story reached the Shah himself. His superiors were afraid that it might not turn into a diplomatic incident. Meanwhile, at the transit station, Carbon and Major Smith became unusually fond of each other, based on the deep respect they had for whiskey. When his sentence was up, Carbon showed not the slightest desire to leave his new friend and jailer. Orders did not work, so threats had to be used. And for a long time afterward, Carbon fondly remembered black and white whiskey and Major Smith. I have a memory from my life in Tehran of one wolf hunt on the mountain slopes of Demavend, and how I was late during an honorable visit to the Iranian street, sir. For this I was summoned before the colonel, who said, "Every morning you will report to the manage of the military school. There you will receive from the Iranian officer on duty the burliest of the thoroughbred Iranian horses. I want to see if you can tame it. It will do you good." But I am a pilot, not a cavalryman, I objected. Besides, I've never been on horseback. Taming a horse may be the noblest of human conquests, but I still prefer it to whiskey. Direct me better to the transfer station. The colonel furrowed his brow, but could not help smiling. "Go away," he grumbled. "I forgive you this time. But be more careful in future. France must always be precise." In Tehran, we were introduced to Major Poyet, our future commander. We met Mathis, who had returned to Cairo after being wounded. We spent several nights asking him about Russia. With anxiety in our hearts, we followed the unfolding of events at the conference, on which, they said, our fate depends. But one December day in 1943, we were put in a huge Soviet airplane, and following the path of the pioneers of the Normandy, we headed for Russia. Baku. Here is our first Russian lunch: cutlets, potatoes, pancakes, which we wash down with tea and milk. Gluttons, hurry up, throws Verdier, holding a dictionary in his hand. Let's take off. It is snowing over the Caucasus. The cold seems terrible to us, and we are so lightly dressed. The weather doesn't improve. Our route has been changed. Instead of landing at Stalingrad airfield, we turn to the Caspian Sea and get stuck in Astrakhan. The Volga is already covered in ice. Sauvage is so stiff, he can't even open his mouth to say a few words. My thin-soled black Chevrolet boots are pathetic. I try to warm my feet by dancing in place, cursing the snow and the cold, which is rather odd for a former French university student ski champion. We are offered an open truck for a familiarization trip to Astrakhan. The offer is accepted. There is no way we can move from our seats. An icy wind is blowing. Our driver, sticking his head under the hood, seems to be studying his engine like a Sunday rebus. At last, the engine rattles, and here we are, hungry, gnashing our teeth, sniffing our noses, fooling around, shaking in the car on the road to the Intourist Hotel. The first night we decided to get acquainted with a Russian cafe. Marshy, sauvage, and I'd walk at random, towards the fine, prickly snow. Suddenly there is light and noise in the distance. I say, I think it must be a cafe. We quicken our step. We approach. We push open the door. The people sitting at the tables wouldn't be more stunned to see Martians entering. We turn back, and wander the streets. From the huge horns come the words that later became so familiar. Moscow speaks. Oh, this is the radio in the streets. This is Moscow speaks, the metallic and pure beat of the Kremlin chimes. Who among us does not remember it? And who among us can say that these sounds are not still standing in our ears? So a small group of French pilots spent their first night on Soviet soil, at the mouth of the majestic Volga River, in the center of the city called Astrakhan. The next day, after a 5-hour flight, we are already in Moscow. The huge snow-covered city seems beautiful to us. We look at the new world with wide-open eyes. The most talkative ones seem to be numb. There are not enough words to express our feelings. Only the rapid beating of our pulse gives away the strength of our feelings and our excitement. Brief greetings. Handshakes. We have been assigned the Savoy Hotel, one of the hotels for foreigners. We can get there by car or subway. I prefer the subway. It's been talked about so much. I can't wait to compare it with our Paris subway. It's quite a sight. The stations, white, red and pink marble and porphyry. Everything around is on fire, sparkling, shimmering, and a hurrying crowd is indifferent to this beauty, which it sees every day. This is how Moscow meets us. Sauvage, Marquis, and I get a shared room at the Savoy. The hotel is posh. The rooms are very warm. Our confidence returns to us. The phone rings. Come on, Marshy, answer it. I turn to my comrade. What's there to say? At least tell me the room number. Which one? 17I. But how do you pronounce it in Russian? 7 nad set. 7 nad 10. Marshy says into the phone. A young, pleasant female voice comes out of the receiver, saying some incomprehensible phrases, and Marshy begins to make circles with his foot. He repeats several times, 7 nad 10, giving his voice the most convincing intonation. 10 minutes later, there is a knock on the door. We hurry to open it. 2 charming Russian girls enter, smiling, cheerful, unpowdered, and rather modestly dressed. We cannot find the right words, even with the help of our dictionary. It's all so unexpected. The girls laugh contagiously and hardly make us realize that they are our guides and that they have been assigned to introduce us to Moscow. Let's go to the Park of Culture, they immediately suggest. This is probably a classic route reminiscent of the Parisian Triangle, Eiffel Tower, Arc de Triomphe, Grevin Museum. The Park of Culture reminds a bit of both Hyde Park and the Bois de Boulogne forest. It stretches along the bank of the Moskva River. Military trophies are displayed between the trees. German tanks, cannons, airplanes, small arms, uniforms. In the Park of Culture, I met a beer seller. The next day, she invited me to her place. I was only interested in a mug of beer, which was not easy to find in 1943, first of all, and a portion of vodka. Secondly, that's how I found myself for the first time in my life in a Russian apartment. But what is surprising even today is how, after drinking beer and vodka, I managed, not knowing a single word of Russian, not knowing the address, to get from the very outskirts of Moscow to the coveted Savoy Hotel. After a tour of the Park of Culture, we were offered to go to the Bolshoi Theater and watch a delightful ballet. It was winter, war all around. Everything animate and inanimate seemed to be strained in an inhuman effort, but in the theater we saw peace and generosity, charm and light, the sparkle of chandeliers, the play of colors, the beauty of movements and poses. In a word, a picture of the world that seemed to have gone forever into the past. So, for several days we walked around Moscow, visited the Lenin Museum, went to the movies, to receptions at the military mission, met with surviving pilots from Normandy who told us in the simplest words about the heroic epic they had just experienced. Comfort, warmth, a comfortable life. All this, it seemed, would never end. But then one evening we heard, Sauvage, Marquis, de Joffre, and all the others, prepare your bags. At 7 p.m. we leave by train for Tula. We meet this not without some regret. Our life as tourists is over. What merry and interesting were the evenings spent together with the deputy Marty, the journalist Champenoy, the writer Ehrenberg, de Signe, de la Poix, Street Marceau, de Pange, who escaped from El Alamein, and other comrades. Farewell, Moscow friends. Farewell, a respite, a shelter, a halt on this road to death. After all, we didn't come here on in-tourist tickets. It took us 5 hours to get from Astrakhan to Moscow. The trip from Moscow to Tula took 12 hours. The train was almost motionless. In the car, heated by an iron stove, we dozed on wooden shelves. It was cold. It was at least 25-degree frost outside, and we were wearing light shoes. Tula. On the platform of the deserted station, an icy wind was blowing. We get out of the carriage and start dancing from the cold. Finally, the interpreter Eichenbaum announces, "Let's get in this truck. A few kilometers from here is an airfield where we will be accommodated, and we will be warmed there." Eichenbaum is a good man. Formerly a weapons mechanic, he was transferred from Madagascar to Djibouti for reasons of disciplinary order. That is, for sympathizing with de Gaulle. From there he escaped in a Potes piloted by a friend of his, also a mechanic. The plane landed in Addis Ababa. From there Eichenbaum traveled to British Somalia, then to South Africa, then to England, then back to the Middle East, and from there to the Soviet Union. His excellent knowledge of Russian and German was very helpful to us. For 2 years he came to the aid of each of us, settled misunderstandings, deflected all blows. There was never a case when he refused to help. We are climbing on the sides of the truck, open to all the winds of Russia, in which the road literally turned into icicles. God, what cold! What bloody cold! Finally the airfield. The cruel suffering is over. We are met by Albert. "Hi, guys." So, still walking around. As someone said, a real wedding trip. A real honeymoon. Walking around, loitering, killing time, and when you're not expecting them, they arrive. "Hello. I'm so glad. What are they talking about in Cairo? What's going on in Algeria? What news from Tehran? Is there mail?" Approaches Ruan Lefebvre, who already has on his combat account 10 shot-down enemy planes, followed by Risso, whose first words were, "Hey guys, isn't there anyone from Marseilles among you?" And here is de la Poix, jokingly called the Viscount, all of him a smile. No sooner had we said hello to the first greeters than a thunderous good. It's Bertrand, nicknamed Old Warrior, and Borgignon, one of the earlier arrivals. "Hello, friends. Are you all still alive? How do you like it? The Russian language, and me, Dan Bertrand." He wasn't very good with languages. In 8 months, he learned only one word, good. But what a loyal friend he was. So contact was made. We've been accepted. Life goes on. So does the war. Well, friends, now it's our turn. I said out loud what everyone was thinking. Imagine 50 guys with all kinds of characters, all kinds of good and bad qualities and habits, people cut off from the world for 6 months in a snow-covered hut, and you will get an idea of what our life was like in Tula from December 25, 1943 to May 25, 1944. From the windows of our small cramped dwelling, we could see the vast white plain with rare birch groves. To the south smoked chimneys Tula with its House of the Red Army, where there is a club, restaurant, theater, billiard, and its own library, intended only for servicemen. Near Tula, we were intensively engaged in training flights on fighter planes. Everyone thought only about one thing: hurry to the front and then home, if we were lucky to return. And they tried to have the best possible time before the battles. As you might expect, the adventure began with the first flights. Laurent and Risso were assigned to transfer 2 Yak to the factory in Moscow. Risso got there safely, but Laurent landed with the retracted landing gear on a snowy field near Moscow because of a damaged gasoline line. On landing, he hits the dashboard hard and loses consciousness. He is brought to his senses and taken to a Moscow hospital. But Moscow is far from Tula, where Rita lives, the very one whom Lawrence's heart yearns for. When he was a little stronger, he ran away from the hospital to us. He could no longer bear to be separated from his beloved. Later, Rita became Madame Laurent, and at the end of the war went with her husband to France. January 12. It is snowing lightly. Training is in full swing. Did Joffre, get ready. Let's make a couple of circles, says to me already famous at that time Lefebvre. I put on my ounce, a fur flight jacket, and a leather helmet with a double felt lining. We approach a two-seat Yak 7 training airplane with dual controls. Beware of the snow, Lefebvre warns. It's very deceptive. A minute later, the machine pulls away from the runway, constantly rolled by rollers, leaving behind a snow swirl. It's freezing. The engine is running perfectly. I can't hear a word Lefebvre is saying to me. 10 minutes into the flight, I lose my bearings completely. There's thick, sticky snow. Lefebvre shows me with his hand that it's time to go back, and as soon as possible. The storm begins. I'm still flying the plane blind. With Lefebvre's help, I find a landing site and start to descend. I approach the white, flat but deceptive surface, completely blinded by the falling snow. And the second the plane touches the ground and begins to bounce, I notice some gray mass ahead. But it's too late. The crash is imminent. The collision occurred at over 100 kilometers per hour. Like a meteor, I crashed into a Lu-5 fighter, which at that time was launching. The propeller of my Yak bit into the fuselage of the Lu-5. The two airplanes, hitched together, froze motionless in a thick cloud of snow. My propeller froze very close to the pilot's cockpit. Another fraction of a second, and the pilot would have been decapitated. Fortunately, he survived unharmed. And so did we. Lefebvre is pissed. You're off to a good start. Nothing to object to. For a long time afterward, Lefebvre was angry with me. But when we were leaving for the front, he took me in his unit, probably wishing to show not only that everything is already forgotten, but also that it is me he would like to have next to him in battle. Staying in Tula was for us a period of waiting, a preface to a big book, when reading which each tried to know the hearts and souls of others. Everyone, of course, has something to tell in this book. A few weeks after my accident, new pilots arrived in Tula. First Bright and Pierrot, and a few days later Lamartelot, my friend Erebarn, Lebre, Bourdieu, Banier, and Moynet. André Moynet would eventually become my squadron commander for the training period. A brave, experienced, energetic pilot, he was one of those who achieved the most good results during the summer and fall campaign of 1944. Already in the rank of lieutenant, he arrived in the Normandy from England, where he flew on July 14, 1940, when he was 19 years old. André Moynet was one of the youngest pilots in the Air Force of the French Fighting Air Force. He traveled with Colonel de Marmier to Brazzaville in 1940, and then participated in the African campaigns in Cameroon, Chad, and Eritrea. He was one of the first to establish the Alsace Group in French Equatorial Africa. Moynet then returns to England, to the Ile-de-France Group, with which he participates in many air battles and scores several victories. Moynet ends the war in the rank of captain. He is awarded the Legion of Honor and the Liberation Cross, and is later elected as a deputy to the National Assembly. Banier was once imprisoned in southeastern France for being too vocal in his opinions on the policies of the Vichy government. But he soon escaped from prison and made his way across the Pyrenees. This guy made us laugh a lot when he told us how he was once forced to follow a coffin in the middle of a funeral procession to elude the gendarmes. He was rescued from arrest in Spain by the French consul, and Banier moved first to Gibraltar, and then to England, where he enlisted as a volunteer in Russia. By then he had flown only a few hours and had absolutely no experience in fighter piloting. Lebre came to Russia from a squadron in Nimes. By his nature he was terribly unsettled and could not resist not to kick someone. He was always indignant and angry, entered into bickering with his elders. He did not recognize defeats and did not tolerate the indifference with which some people accept them. Cunning, determined, taking any risk, Ledra crossed Spain quickly, avoiding police checkpoints and making fun of all sorts of agents, and finally reached Algiers. Iribarne joined us in Meknes. When I speak of Iribarne, a whole world of memories comes alive in me. A comrade in work and in battle, in sports and in entertainment, a friend in spirit, with whom we shared common strengths and weaknesses. Iribarne died one cold winter morning in the skies above Königsberg. Dear Iribarne. His courage and loyalty to the cause carried him, along with 3 other Normandy pilots, into a fierce pursuit. Iribarne was never to return from this battle. The bitter frost does not stop. The snow crunches underfoot. From time to time, we furtively look at the thermometer. The temperature does not rise above -25 degrees, but often falls to -30. We put down the earphones of fur hats and try to go outside as little as possible. On February 15, at 11 o'clock in the morning, we all line up at a small birch grove. Near the sparkling under the pale rays of the February sun, just arrived wonderful machines, Yak 9 with 37mm cannon. The gray coloring of the fuselage, the scarlet blood of the Soviet stars, the nose of the plane painted in the 3 colors of the French flag, all this contrasts amazingly with the dazzling whiteness of the snowy plain. In the cloudless sky, we hear the noise of an engine. It is a Douglas flying from Moscow. The plane landed at our airfield. Out of it come Russian generals, Shimonov and Levendovich, and French General Petit. After a while begins a solemn formation and the ceremony of awarding orders. The commander of the pushed Pied, Captain Biguin, Lieutenants Albert, Lefebvre and de la Pointe are awarded the Soviet orders of the Combat Red Banner. Junior lieutenants are awarded the Order of the Patriotic War of the First Degree. Foucault, Janelle, and Mathis, who at that time were in the hospital, are awarded the Order of Patriotic War IA degree. Posthumously, the same order and the French Order of the Legion of Honor awarded to the dead: Leon, Balcu, Denis, Bon, and Larjo. In the frosty air sounds Marseillaise, then a new Russian hymn, majestic and courageous, with a bright pathetic sound. The French and Russian flags are flying on the mast. Their colors stand out sharply over the white plain surrounding us. The official ceremony is over. A friendly celebration awaits. Taking me under her arm, Marshy says, "In the evening we're going to Tula. There'll be a ball at the Red Army House. What will we take? By hitchhikers. I don't particularly like that way of traveling. Once I climbed into the back of a hitchhiker and found myself next door to a coffin. They were taking a dead man to the cemetery. It somewhat spoiled my mood that evening." Evenings in the Red Army House in Tula were very pleasant. Located in the center of Tula, a city with a population of over 300,000 people, the DKA attracted all the youth of the city and all the military from the garrisons located within the city limits and its environs. Almost every evening, starting at 7 o'clock, a large crowd gathers in front of the entrance. In the lobby, they leave coats, overcoats, gloves, scarves, overshoes, galoshes, and felt boots. On the first floor, there is an auditorium and a hall for dancing. In the cafeteria, you can drink beer and sometimes vodka. Here there are plays, concerts, singers, and folk ensembles perform. The famous Moscow ballerina Lepshinskaya came here more than once to perform Adagio from Tchaikovsky's ballet Swan Lake. We often listened here to performances of the Red Army Song and Dance Ensemble. The Soviet command always paid much attention to the leisure of soldiers both at the front and in the rear. After the performance, usually began dancing to the accordion, danced more waltzes. When there were not enough girls, it was not uncommon to see soldiers dancing in pairs. For every Russian, dancing is an important and significant activity. Civilian or military, man or woman, young man or old man, everyone twirls in a fast rhythm. On this evening, the Normandy is a definite success. "Come on, it's your turn." I turn to one of the pilots standing next to me. You see, in the corner stands a young woman, a military doctor. She dances marvelously. The pilot hurries over there. I'll try to ask the tall brunette standing against the wall to dance. I just wish she'd say yes. Sometimes, because of shyness, girls refuse. It was here during one of these dances that Laurent met the charming Rita, to whom he became engaged 10 minutes before his flight to Paris. And these wonderful conversations with female students, many of whom know Zola, Balzac, and Romain Rolland. They often stumped me. French literature is honored here. If the evenings were very pleasant, the returns were not at all pleasant. Often we were late for the car we were given and had to walk along the gloomy, endless boulevard that stretches across the city from north to south. We crossed the river on ice. We passed the monumental gates of the arms factory, which operated day and night and produced, among other things, TT Army pistols. Usually it took a good 2 hours to reach our sentry's booth. Wrapped in a long tunic, he usually greeted us with a loud cry. "Who's coming?" Normandy, the regiment, a French pilot. We tried to answer as quickly as possible, because in Russia sentries do not hesitate and shoot. One evening a tragicomic incident happened to me, which could have ended very sadly for me. The next day I was summoned by Poyad on this occasion. "I heard that a funny story happened to you yesterday." "Yes, my commander." "And if I got that fool, that hooligan, who had the wit to remove the cover of the sewer manhole in the center of the boulevard, he would not be unfortunate." So I told the commander what had happened. It was especially annoying that, passing by during the day, I saw that damned hole. I even told Sauvage that I should be careful at night not to go there. And then the very thing I feared happened. It was like the abyss opened up beneath my feet. Luckily, I had time to spread my arms and grab the edge of the hatch. Otherwise I would have broken my neck. To die not in the line of duty, but in a well of filth, while we had come to be heroes. I must confess that there was nothing sublime about it. The regimental commander rolled with laughter. "Be aware, de Joffre," he said to me after a little puff of breath. "In Russia, as everywhere else, one must always know where to put one's foot." And then, turning to Bertrand, he began to question him. "Well, and you? It seems that something funny happened to you too." Bertrand's breath caught. He blushed. The poor fellow began to gesticulate nervously, and then, unable to stand it, exploded. "Yes, my commander. To do such a mischief to me, a true Bourguignon, an old warrior. Martin and I went into town, just to shake things up a bit. You know what I'm talking about. Walking around, talking. Towards the end we got confused in a maze of small streets on one of Tula's outskirts. We are crowding on the snow and don't know where to turn to get back to the camp. Suddenly, a group of people in overcoats appears out of the ground. Who the hell could tell who it was? It was so dark that you could hardly recognize your own sister. They come right up to us, blinding us with an electric flashlight. I tell Martin that they probably want to check our IDs. We take out our IDs. We shove them under our noses. But damn them all. Them and all their ancestors. I wish to hell they'd fry in a frying pan in the next world. They snatched my TT and started laughing. And ran away. You can imagine, my commander, what a joke they played on me. For many days, every time Bertrand was about to go to town, there was some wit who would casually say to him, "You're going to Tula. Don't forget your TT. Maybe you'll meet someone you lent it to." And every time our kindly Bertrand blushed to the ears and, rolling his eyes up to his forehead, began to swear in his figurative Bourguignon language. Life went on as usual. The days began to grow longer, but it was still cold. The evil fate was weighing on us. We broke everything possible, from propellers to landing gear. On March 18, these failures took a sad turn. About 11 o'clock in the sky, covered with heavy clouds, for a training flight rose Jouard and Bourdieu. Jouard is the leader. Bourdieu follows him. Jouard enters one of the huge low clouds and radios. "Pull up, Bourdieu, otherwise you'll get lost." Bourdieu pulls up. Wing-to-wing steam disappears in the gray absorbent cotton clouds, and there at a speed of more than 400 kilometers per hour cars collide. Like two blowhards with dislocated joints, they tumble downward, tumbling. Jord makes a final effort and jumps out. His parachute opens, but he is not to be saved. The falling plane's wing touches the silk dome of his parachute. It bursts into flames like a torch. Jord falls to the ground with the burning wreckage of his yak, a few meters from the crashing into the ground car comrade. Bourdieu was killed on impact. When Jord's body was found, he was lying as if alive. He was smiling. His face was calm and seemed almost happy. What a terrible fate. Failure always caught up with him at the very last minute at all the turns of life. It was on this day, an hour after Jord's departure, that the news came that he had been promoted to the rank of junior lieutenant. And I can't bring myself not to think that if this promotion, expected by everyone for weeks now, had been received even a day earlier, Jord might have been released from flying on March 18, and perhaps he would still be alive today. His father, who had previously lost another son, died of grief a year after our regiment had returned to France. The bodies of the two friends were buried near the airfield in a small grove. A blizzard of snow was howling. The wind was bending the thin birch trees to the ground. When I watched as they lowered into the dead, frozen ground miserable coffins made of simple boards, I only then truly understood the true meaning of the words parting and native land. But the day of March 18 could have been a wonderful day for us. A new group of pilots led by Captain Delfino arrived from Moscow that day. He was scheduled with the consent of Poilade and the Soviet command as commander of the new French Air Regiment Paris, which wanted to create on the model of Normandy. Captain Delfino was a proven fighter pilot who had survived 1940. He would later lead the Normandy during operations in East Prussia and would end the war with 16 enemy aircraft shot down. The personal qualities of this pilot, and especially his strong and energetic character, were the key to the success of the regiment. But for organizational reasons, this regiment was never created, and all the newly arrived pilots were included in the Normandy. Among them were my old comrades in the service, Jeans, Pinon, Lumar, Imon, the two brothers Schall, Perrin, Manceau, Kernet, Menhu, Mikel, Gaston, Tabaret. They had to begin their service in the Normandy regiment by attending a funeral. The disaster of March 18 is followed by a series of other failures. Imon lands to the left of the strip and damages two airplanes. Schick, our interpreter, who had just been authorized to fly fighter sorties, despite insufficient flight hours, lands after forgetting to release the landing gear. And on March 30, in the presence of General Zakharov, writer Elia Ehrenberg, and former Minister Pierre Cot, a rather unusual incident occurred, the culprit of which, or if you like, a lucky hero, this time turned out to be a graduate student Monier. Training flights were in full swing. Lefebvre called the pilots of the 3rd Squadron, which included Monier, and said, "Gentlemen, today we perform an exercise on the flight of lynx in a close formation, then a single pilotage, and finally, rearrangement over Stalinogorsk. In conclusion, the whole squadron will pass over the airfield in parade formation. To the planes. Take off in 5 minutes. Act so that our guests see what we can do. The 3rd Squadron is taking off link by link. The weather's been nasty lately, but today there's not a cloud in the sky. Exercises, timed by minutes, follow one after the other. They are performed precisely, quickly, and skillfully. Rebuilding takes place over the Stalinogorsk metallurgical plant, whose tall chimneys spit out puffs of black smoke into the clear blue sky. The cars pass over the group of our guests flawlessly. The performance is over. One by one, the airplanes land. And suddenly a drama plays out. Monier, who sat last, on the radio reports the alarming news. The engine failed because the fuel supply has stopped. The pilot can still jump out with a parachute, but he wants to save the plane at any cost. He decides to land with the engine stopped. The landing strip is cleared with lightning speed. Counting seconds, we slide in for the landing. As the plane approaches, I catch myself saying out loud, "Not enough altitude." Very little. Too little. The plane is descending. There are 100 meters left to the landing strip, and before it is a solid wall of trees. I clench my teeth, close my eyes, and feel a cold sweat breaking out. The car hits the treetops. With a terrible rumble, like a giant hammer hitting an anvil, it falls to the ground, bounces, and falls again, falling to pieces. Everyone rushes to the scene of the fall. I'm one of the first to arrive. What's wrong with Monier? Unbelievable. He lifts himself up among the rubble, stands up, and even takes a few steps. We freeze. Monier smiles. He's alive. Blood trickles from an oblong wound on his right cheek. Monier holds his hands on his lower back as if he's having a sciatica attack. They pick him up. They take him to the infirmary. He still manages to tell us, "This time, it's not over yet." This terrible ordeal was the fourth in Monier's life. In England, in 1941, he crashed into a house after flying under high-tension wires. In 1942, during a high-altitude flight, he lost consciousness. Left to itself, the hurricane spun in the air, performing acrobatic figures that would make even the most fearless of people's hair stand on end. At the moment when the plane was about to crash into the ground in front of the horror-stricken people expecting imminent disaster, Monier came to his senses and managed to land the plane as if nothing had happened. In Palestine, in 1943, a malfunction of the engine forced him to land, or rather landed, on Lake Tiberiad. And although the airplane scapotized, Monier still managed to get out of the half-sunken airplane and reach the shore. Finally, he got his fifth reprieve from death later at Antonovo, when he had to return alone after an exceptionally hard-striking flight and land with completely dry tanks. Yes, it can be said that Monier, our winner of death, will more than once make us age 10 years in a few seconds. Gifted with extraordinary strength, Monier could not live without adventure. After the war, he still continued to play with fate, testing jets Hurricane, produced by the firm Dassault. On the same memorable day, Bertrand was invited to speak on Moscow radio. He had to say a few words to his fellow countrymen. The program turns out to be unusually comical. Bertrand carefully prepared an impressive speech. Here he is a clear step to the microphone. Suddenly, we see the speaker turn pale. He looks for his notes, but can't find them. The cameraman is worried. Bertrand has no choice but to improvise. And so, in his Bourguignon tongue, in a rich, thick voice, old Bertrand says what's on his heart. Hello. Hello. Moscow speaking. Hello. This is Bertrand speaking. Bourguignonians, brothers. Bourguignonians, friends. Don't worry, very soon I'll be back to you. And then we'll all get together and drink a good glass of wine. Well, goodbye. Goodbye soon, brothers. The speech is over. Bertrand, flushed with exertion but happy, returns to us. We are literally rolling with laughter. He looks proud and joyful. He exclaims nonchalantly, "What's up, guys? Did you hear how well I got out of it?" The vodka starts to play tricks on us too. One morning, when we were especially overcome by boredom, which seemed to fall from the heavens together with the prickly snow, when the wind howled angrily, when our noses froze to the frost-covered window pane, through which we stared intently and silently into the vast white plain, motionless and silent, when in the depths of our souls began an attack of unbearable longing, despondency, languor, my friend Gaston tried to find in this potion consolation for the soul and much-needed warmth for the body. Everyone had seen him frequently tapping his voluminous flask that day, which at the time was not surprising to anyone. We paid no attention to him until he fell to the floor in the midst of our reminiscences of past times. All day long Gaston lay there in unconsciousness. I never left his side for a moment, and at times I thought he seemed to stiffen more and more. The night passed terribly, for me, at least. However, the next day, when the sun was already high in the sky, Gaston, having risen before me, sang at the top of his voice the then fashionable tango Tatiana, as if nothing had happened to him. April 16, 1944, the Russian command entrusted Normandy air defense of Tula. It was a high honor bestowed upon us. 300,000 inhabitants, gun factories, and young female visitors to the Red Army House. That's whose safety we had to ensure. In anticipation of a possible German attack, the studies continued. On April 21, about noon, Lieutenant Foucault was performing a slow barrel roll, completing his morning sortie. To perform this classic aerobatics figure, he began to roll over onto his back at high speed. 100 meters high. Suddenly, the machine dives sharply. A quarter of a second, and a terrible explosion shook the camp. Flames, smoke. There was nothing left of Foucault or his plane. Maybe he hadn't recovered enough from the severe injury he received last year. Lefebvre tells us in great excitement. Foucault had a thickening of the spine. Because of this, he felt dizzy, sometimes even lost consciousness. We don't answer. Poor Foucault. That's all we can say as we escort his remains to a small birch grove, which, alas, we are beginning to visit all too often. Gentlemen of the Normandy, I assure you that in a month we will be at the front. Be patient, wait, prepare. I am waiting for 5 more pilots. Captain Matras, Lieutenant de la Salle, and the graduate students Bayside, Versini, and Laurelin, who should arrive in a few days. Another squadron, the Cana Squadron, will be formed. I was also informed that in the first days of May we will receive a new batch of aircraft, 20 Yak-9 fighters armed with 37mm cannon. Don't tear up. Serious tests will not be long in coming. Very soon we will begin to fulfill combat missions. With these encouraging words opens the meeting Regimental Commander Poyet gathered all of us in his headquarters. Our mood was not at its best. The endless waiting was annoying. It seemed to us that there was nothing more to learn, that we were fully prepared to go pound the Germans. Enough of losing scales. We wish for a big concert, we reasoned. But now this nervousness, this dissatisfaction disappear in a flash. They are removed as if by hand by the promise of Regimental Commander Poyet. And as if to give more weight to these promises, feverish activity is unfolding at our Tula airfield. Fighters Yak-9, La-5, Il-2 attack aircraft, P-2 bombers and American planes, Aerocobra, and Boston are continuously arriving and landing. They are piloted by Soviet pilots with weathered, tanned faces. Po-2s piloted by young female pilots arrive frequently. We have endless conversations with the arriving pilots about various methods of training. Little by little, I begin to understand how the Soviet government was able to raise the entire Russian people, such a multinational country, to fight against the aggressor. In the Soviet Union, perhaps more than anywhere else, courage and heroism are honored as the highest human virtue. Courage and heroism are sung by poets and glorified by writers. Portraits of heroes are placed in all magazines and in all newspapers. Once I saw on the fuselage of an airplane written in big red letters the name, Matrosov. Who is it? I was interested. Everyone was terribly surprised that I knew nothing about the exploits of this simple Russian soldier, who was posthumously awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. By closing the embrasure of the German pillbox with his chest, he gave his company the opportunity to advance. Among Soviet pilots, most of all speak about Ivan Kozydub, ace of aces, who shot down 62 enemy planes in the war. Once he shot down 6 airplanes in 4 hours. By that time, Ivan Kozydub was only 25 years old, but he already had the rank of major, while he started the war as a junior sergeant at a flying school. He was born into a peasant family in a village near the town of Shaska, Sumy region. Now he is a deputy of the Supreme Soviet of the USSR. Already during training, Kozydub was always ahead of his comrades. In June 1943, he was sent to the section of the front near Kursk, where he won more than 20 victories. His motto: have a hot heart and a cold mind. Focusing in battle all the attention on his opponent, Kozydub at the same time sees everything around him and manages to give advice to his comrade in time. His pilots tell that during the battle they constantly heard his voice on the radio. Korolev, Messerschmitt on the right. Ivanov, attention. Look back. Vasily, cover Ivanov's tail. All right, Pyotr. Now the Messerschmitt is mine. On the last day of the war over Berlin, he shot down 2 enemy planes. After the end of the war, Kozhedub was awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union for the 3rd time. Another ace, 3 times Hero of the Soviet Union, Colonel Pokryshkin, shot down 59 enemy planes during the war. The names of Soviet pilots of the Glinka brothers are also well known. The older brother was already famous, having on his combat account of 25 downed airplanes, when the younger was weary of impatience in flight school. He begged his brother to take him to the front with him. In response, the elder talked about order, obedience, discipline. However, the younger still achieved his own, got to the front, and there followed in his brother's footsteps. 6 months later, he also became a hero of the Soviet Union. Below I will tell you more about my friend Major Ahmet Khan Sultan, who used the famous ram. Do you know what a battering ram is? It is the highest self-sacrifice of a Russian pilot who, having used up all his ammunition, rushes at an enemy plane and hits it with his machine. In 90 cases out of 100, it is imminent doom. Ahmet managed to be among the lucky ones. Russian pilots, whom we often meet in the canteen, tell us about the fierce air battles at Stalingrad. Maybe not everyone at that time clearly realized that the Battle of Stalingrad was the most serious test for Russian aviation. Listening to stories about the Stalingrad battles, we involuntarily felt an extraordinary excitement. New airplanes kept arriving. Albert was constantly hovering around Nana, the clerk of our unit, so as not to miss in time to get ultra-secret information. It was he who reported that we were supposedly allotted a section of the front between Orsha and Vitebsk, where German pilots will be examiners for those of our graduate students who want to become officers. The first days of May, but winter, straining its last strength, is still trying to push back spring. When it seems to everyone that spring is firmly entrenched in its positions, suddenly the snow begins to fall. But General Winter's counterattacks, as well as the Germans' counterattacks, were ultimately doomed to failure. Now it is our turn to familiarize ourselves with the charms of the stormy Russian spring, which so enchanted our comrades last year. It seems that the snow has barely had time to melt, but the birch trees have already turned green, the grass has risen, lush and dense, and the first flowers have flashed. In one of the evenings of this fabulous Russian spring, I sent a letter to my wife. This is what I wrote. My wife and my little girl, Antoinette and Claudine, spring has come here. I want to shout with joy. Spring is a magical word that makes you dream. Nature, animals, people, everyone feels reborn. The future is very near, wonderful, with the wonderful fragrance of flowers, with green leaves fluttering on the branches, with sprouting bread, with a sky in which the bright sun shines. For you, Antoinette, this is another step that leads to our meeting. It is the joy and happiness of being loved and loving. It is our love. It is us. It is the hot kisses we gave each other and those that await us ahead. For me, spring is a great battle into which I throw myself along with nature, awakening, like humans, from its nightmare. It is the dawn of a beautiful, radiant victory, the first steps on the road to home. It is revenge, the glittering sword that will bring down the Nazi invaders. But the time was not right for either epistolary outpourings or stylistic exercises. After a few practice firings, the training was declared over. Unnecessary things were sent to Moscow, accompanied by the faithful Eichenbaum. Now, any minute now could come an order with a capital letter, and then 60 yaks will take to the air and leave Tula, to the front. While waiting for the flight, we, Marshy, Erebarn and I, walk through the surrounding villages. We go through everything like real reporters, and if we don't understand something, we ask again and again. In this way, we gradually begin to imagine a real picture of life in the Russian village. During our walks, we often find rifles, cartridges, German helmets, traces of the Wehrmacht offensive, which reached almost to Tula. Once we took a bus trip 30 kilometers south of Tula to Yasnaya Polyana, where Leo Tolstoy's estate is located. It was savagely destroyed by the Nazis. In the center of the birch grove is Tolstoy's grave, a simple mound of earth without a tombstone and inscriptions, covered only with wildflowers, as the writer wished. Near the grave of the great writer desecrated by the Nazis buried about 80 soldiers of the Wehrmacht, killed in battle near the house of the writer. On our return from the trip, we learn the long-awaited news. Finally, we fly to the front. A top-secret telegram has arrived. Someone knows its contents. Someone has heard of it. Excitement grows, spreads throughout the camp, reaches the city. The Russians rush to congratulate us and drink to our future successes. It soon becomes known that General Petit will inspect us on May 20. Resolutions follow. Ready to go to the front, fit to fight. The last shot of vodka will be drunk, and on May 25, exactly at 10 o'clock, 60 Yaks, Normandy, will leave the Tula airfield to land in Dubrovka. The Second Normandy campaign would begin.